Well, Jennifer, I'm grateful that you've been part of Mennonite Creation Care Network from basically the beginning. I forget how I tagged you to say, hey, you ought to help with this.
Well, I was here.
Right. Well, and I also knew your interest. I mean, you were drawn to Mary Lee because of the faith component that made up Mary Lee as well, at least as I recall, in those early days.
And I had background.
Right. And for me, it was interesting to see the whole concept of Mennonite Creation Care Network for Mennonite Church USA in Canada kind of emerge out of a loss. And the loss was the former group that existed had disbanded. And I got to thinking that, well, Mary Lee happens to be probably the place where the most people assemble on a daily basis who are working on the environment, environmental issues, environmental education, etc., and have a faith perspective of anywhere in the Mennonite Church across the continent. Now, that sounds a little presumptuous, but I think it's probably true as well in terms of being so focused on that. So knowing that there had been a loss of the former organization, I contacted church leadership and said, we realize the loss has happened. We still see it as a need. Can we help somehow? And so as a result, we started meeting to do planning and created what now is Mennonite Creation Care Network to serve those denominations. I know that this would not have happened if the founders of Mary Lee had not seen faith as an important component of who Mary Lee happens to be, or if they had not donated it to Goshen College, which also has a faith underpinning. So knowing that that faith underpinning was there was a springboard for the other connections that started to be formed. And so after doing this planning work and forming a council, then I provided the main leadership for the first 10 years and knew that change was also needed back then. And so you've been leading it since this point, which I'm grateful for that.
I think one of the things that has struck me most about the story about how Mennonite Creation Care Network began and what you were referring to as a loss was the way that it grew out of a question. The question being, what should we do with these old minutes? Does anybody want them? Wasn't that?
That was a big question.
that brought this whole thing up. And as a taker of minutes, it's kind of significant to me that, the minutes were what generated a question, and the question generated this whole new direction for the Creation Care Network.
Yeah.
At this point, we have about 1,100 people on our newsletter list. We have about 70 churches that are connected as churches. And people are aware of us and are looking for ways, I think, to connect their faith with creation.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the benefits of Mary Lee being the most major sponsor of Mennonite Creation Care Network, along with Everence and their support and some individual donors, but being the major sponsor of the work, including supporting your role, has given us connections for other conversations with other faith groups, interfaith conversations, other denominations, that I'm not sure how we would have had those. There might have been some other way, but it certainly has been beneficial for us to be known for having that voice into the faith question around environmental issues, climate change.
I found the recent conversation we had with the Rocha really helpful. And they were here to visit Mary Lee. That wouldn't have happened otherwise.
Right.
And also, and this is through Mary Lee being a part of Goshen College as well, our connection with Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions
Correct.
would not have happened if we weren't part of Mary Lee, because Goshen is a partner organization, and all of the work we've done with the pastoral retreats has grown out of that.
Right.
We've done 3 pastoral retreats on climate change now with 3 different sets of pastors, and all of them have been exciting
Yeah.
and well received, I would say.
Yeah. It's interesting, when I was being interviewed 22 years ago for this job, some of the board members were saying, well, we want somebody who can make sure that Mary Lee is not the best kept secret in northern Indiana. And I thought, well, that's a pretty audacious kind of thing to say. And not that that was the driving force of my goal, but just to recognize that as you've traveled around to these pastoral retreats, and then the many other connections that our team have beyond the borders of Mary Lee, that Mary Lee is known much, much more widely. Not that there isn't still more opportunity for that, but that's fun and rewarding just to recognize that influence is out there. It was fun to be reminded of Caitlin, a graduate student alum, who was talking about her church studying creation care materials, and as a result of studying a book that I wrote, looking on the web and finding that, oh, connected to that is Mary Lee, and oh, they have a graduate program. And she goes ahead and applies and has been a student, graduated from the program, and is now working in Chain Lake State Parks as a naturalist, environmental educator.
So how was creation care already being articulated as kind of a focus when you would have come on 22 years ago? I mean, and with that specific language, or was it more kind of stewardship and just this awareness that these pieces somehow fit together?
Creation care as a term 22 years ago was not very well known, was not a term used at all, like in my interview process directly. The evangelical environmental or creation care group was already functioning,
This
but
is what preceded?
no, this is a national group, a separate group. I'm just thinking of kind of where the term creation care started being used, and so I think the evangelical environmental network may have been some of the first ones to be using that terminology. It was much more stewardship as a point of reference when I started, but then creation care became a more commonly used term. I think there's several ways in which why that emerged that way. One of them has to do with recognizing that we're more of a participant with than a lording over. And I still like the term stewardship, but it can sound like, well, humans are then in charge of managing everything. I do believe we have pretty critical roles, but creation care then is a different way of saying, well, we are also part of it. And for a faith group, and so it's not just Mennonite Creation Care Network, but there are other religious groups that use creation care as well. There's this acknowledgement of God as creator, even within the term of that, and so making this spiritual connection within the term itself has been helpful. So earth care is also a great term, but it doesn't pick up on the theological in quite the same way that using the term like creation care does.
And eco-theology has evolved a lot in the last 20 years, 20, 30 years as well. When I was in seminary in the late 1980s, it really wasn't on the radar. And I went to a very progressive seminary. So, yeah, a lot of that happened in the 90s and onward. So.
What was the group that preceded the Creation Care Network?
It was the Mennonite Environmental Task Force.
Okay.
which was also an interesting term because task force sounds like it's for a short duration, right? You form a task force, you do your job, then you're done, right? So not that it's a wrong term, but I mean, they did serve from 1989 as a result of a resolution within the Mennonite Church on up until 2002, I think it was, because then we started working on things in 2003, 4. By 2005 is when it was officially recognized as Mennonite Christian Care Network. But it's also an interesting reminder. You can look back into 1989. You can look back to a few documents from the 1970s where naming environmental stewardship, caring for creation, climate change were on the church's radar, at least for a few people. And it did get recorded in some documents. It seems like a long time of trying to get there, and we still need to keep nudging lots of people along the way.
Well, so beyond the outreach, then, the serving as a kind of a hub for the Creation Care Network and the helping advance thinking and awareness in the broader community, how has that thinking really been internalized then, or reflected some of the shifts in thinking here at Mary Lee? From the founding and kind of the original vision to this awareness of stewardship. I mean, to thinking of it in terms of creation care and just this evolution of thinking. Have you seen that evolve in any certain way here at Mary Lee in terms of focusing on this place, this land, and the education that's taking place here?
Mm-hmm.
When we talk often about how the Wreaths had a faith foundation and a desire that be part of Mary Lee, and the fact that religious was in our original title, the Mary Lee Religious, what was it?
Nature and Religious Foundation.
Nature and Religious Foundation. We talk about that, but like when I read the minutes, I mean, they were business people. They weren't theologians.
Right.
So I feel like Luke has given their desire so much more sophistication and depth than what, sort of their rudimentary sense that the church was part of what they were doing. So I would say Luke has really helped that evolve.
Yeah, and it is true. Sometimes it feels like you're digging for nuggets. Is there something in here or isn't there when you read like old minutes or statements? And I don't feel like we've done injustice to that. I think it is bringing it to light. So the fact that in 1973, 74, the original Mary Lee, that was a standalone nonprofit, had done very good strategic master planning, and they included one of their main 4 points was the importance of recreation or recreation, where bodies and spirits would be enhanced by being here at Mary Lee and being engaged in meaningful work and building trails or helping with projects, but also just enjoying the beauty of nature. So they were articulating it in that way. And in fact, seeing that part as recreation as one of the 3 parts of our mission statement, when I was applying, that was the point that said, oh, that gives me merit for looking at this job seriously. Caring about the land, I mean, that sounded good and important to me, and providing environmental education. But this other piece about recreation of body and spirit was clearly an indicator to me of the distinctiveness of Mary Lee, as well as, I don't know that I understood what it could become, but that's been a wonderful part of the unfolding as we go along. And I think we as a whole team talk about this a lot more directly than probably even when you came. I mean, it's more a part of our regular conversations of faith connection. It's not. I find it to be very genuine kinds of conversations. It's not like putting a frosting on, like, here's the frosting faith layer. Instead, it's more thinking about where and why are we coming at this the way we are, in a genuine way.
One thing we did for about a decade was to have a annual conference, which we call the Autumn Hope Conference, where we pulled together people from various walks of life, some more scientific and some more from a faith background, would come together for a weekend. And unlike most conferences where you're shut in a box, conference center or something, a good part of the programming was out on the land, and we were working at integrating faith and the created world around various themes like water. We did climate change one year, and yeah, I think that was important for a number of people.
So, for where things are now, I mean, I have a very limited perspective on kind of how things are unfolding in the broader faith community, or certainly here. My sense is that creation care isn't the go-to language that is we go to as much now as it was maybe 10 years ago for talking about those intersections. And so I kind of wonder what is. In the broader kind of evolution of thinking, like climate change, for instance, has shifted to some of the more kind of physical systems to the social systems and the social justice components of it, and looking at these broader dimensions of things. I don't know how, this increasing awareness, for instance, then of climate change and this more systemic awareness of the challenges that we're facing, how has that permeated, the articulation of creation care in this intersection of faith and stewardship here at Mary Lee?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the changes that happen, and so I see the same trajectory you were just talking about of you have stewardship, you have creation care, you have some major issues that will also be the focus of attention, like climate change, or it could be a whole array of sustainability, whether it's from a physical building concept to a social structure system that needs to be looked at sustainably. I don't personally feel locked into a single term, because I think there's a broader context in which we're working, and sometimes I will use one language set in the conversation, and other times I'll use another language set in a conversation, because it's all part of this larger system, and you just pay attention to where you are in the web as to what is needed. The part for me personally and in my thought is that we are all working out of a value system, and it can be articulated multiple ways, and sometimes in very strong religious terms or faith-based terms, but we really are all working out of a set of value systems, many of which are held in common with each other, which is a key, because I think we have and continue to often polarize around these issues for a variety of what I think are pretty crazy reasons usually. But when we stop and think about it, well, we have a lot of values that are in common. And if we always will remind ourselves of that, then we can take better actions looking into the future. And so I think the best approach is to have this multiple pronged language set that one is comfortable using. And if somebody says, well, I don't like using sustainability because I think it's just become a catchphrase, it's like, that's fine. There are concepts we probably don't want to let go of. But if it makes more sense to talk about resilience now, let's talk about resilience, or regeneration, or renewal, or restoration. Is kind of find the piece that makes the most sense for that particular context. And it's good to have that dialogue, but to get locked into opposition about we're either doing this or we're not doing this doesn't help.
I would say a couple of language sets that we had been in dialogue with and that had become part of our work here. One would be watershed discipleship. Back in 2013, Luke enabled me to go to a gathering that Ched Myers drew together on where he first put forth his paper on watershed discipleship. Luke wasn't able to go; he had teaching responsibilities. But we are in dialogue with Ched, and that particular emphasis where you're looking at what can be done locally. Luke is also has been very involved with the doctrine of discovery movement in the Anabaptist tradition, and working with some of those folks on environmental justice kinds of things. So we do go in and out of these different language worlds.
Well, the language worlds reflect the different world views that many people are arriving at or coming into these conversations with, and so it's a helpful way of observing that.
Mm-hmm. I think there's what I can see as a parallel between the language you choose to use and what an individual person's gifts are as well. So we can't all do everything. So we need some who are working from one frame, as long as we're not working as islands in isolation from each other. Because there are lots of things I can't do. And so I need other people to be digging deeper into the scientific, or people digging deeper into the social sciences realm of things. And I think that's where we sometimes are called to so which is the most important thing to do? No, that's not the point at all. It's we all need all of the gifts to be able to work on this well.
I think that's one of the beauty of Luke's gifts to us as leading in his leadership role here is that emphasis. I mean, from the very beginning, Mennonite Creation Care Network was always very big tent, as opposed to just a group of activists and just trying to attract that kind of person, or just a group of gardeners and trying to attract that. And we're still working at trying to incorporate all the different kinds of people, the gardeners as well as the donors, as well as the people that like to teach children, environmental educators, things like that. And we hear that from churches. I did a survey at one point where two different people said the same thing, and they hadn't talked to each other. Can you help us? Can you give us some tools to talk about the fact that we go about caring for the earth differently? And we worked that.
All right.
Well, just one last question.
Sure.
Transition to capture some of the other...
to get outside.
Yeah. So what then, coming back around to the, Mary Lee as this unique hub, this unique place that's serving this broader conversation in a unique way, what is that space that's most important for it to help hold as a hub for the broader conversation, the broader shifts in thinking that are taking place, like here and now and going forward? What is the maybe that's too broad, maybe there isn't anything that you would really settle on, but what is that key role then in this evolving conversation and awareness that's taking place around us that Mary Lee can best contribute to?
Mm-hmm.
Is that...
Yeah, I think kind of tying back into the multiple language pieces and needs for different areas, I think the role that Mary Lee has played and can play is a place where these conversations can begin. This is not a place where the conversations end. If this were the place where the conversation would end, let's take sustainable buildings. that would mean that we would continue to be just building buildings to demonstrate how sustainable we can make them. Well, that's not our role. We're a place where you can have conversations about sustainable design and constructed buildings, and we can show you some of the work we've done, but we've actually done them because we're trying to achieve some other goals, like educating undergraduate students or graduate students or children from the school system. So we're really a beginning point for conversations. Some people may want to come on site and understand a prairie system and its main functions, or a wetland system, or the interface between the two. Well, we can talk about that too, but we're not going to do the ultimate research on that. But it becomes a very important place to start the conversation, get some really good information about it, get some strong examples about it, and then people need to go out and work beyond. And of course, we want people to keep coming back and re-engaging in the conversation, because we're learning as we go along as well. But we're not an end-all. We're a launching pad or a springboard.
There's a real need for professionals in environmental work, for people who have given their lives to these issues. And Mary Lee is a nest of those folks. And it's, the wreath's made a real gift to the church and the broader world in making that able to happen. I see the contrast with churches. You might have one professional and one environmental professional in a congregation, or you have a lot of transition. Pastors come and go, and they're the one paid leader, and then you lose momentum on the creation care pieces. So just a place where people have ongoing full-time work on these issues is huge.
I really like how you brought it back around to the leadership component of that too, because this idea of creating space for conversation to begin, it reflects this kind of growing awareness and shift the way we think about leadership and what it takes to facilitate that kind of conversation, to convene those conversations in the first place and hold them in a way where they can really grow, where they're not being just drugged along towards a downloading of this is what we want you to think, but opening up space for things to emerge.
Right.
So I really, that's something that's really coming out to me here in just the conversations already so far today, is this this complementary balance between the educational focus and the leadership focus, and how those play off each other, especially when we were talking about kind of these more systems thinking, these broader changes in the way we think, and this kind of root ecological presence that allows us to ground and learn from. So
and for me, the frame that I'm committed to working on and continuing to learn is, how does one lead being informed by ecology? So ecological leadership as a more emerging leadership pattern, but I think a very healthy one. And so I've enjoyed reading about that, thinking about that, and want to understand that more fully. And I also recognize that there's a tie to that kind of thinking to very old thinking, the thinking that indigenous peoples have used throughout millennia in their approach to leadership. There are different styles out there, but being informed by the ecological systems in which you live is a very healthy thing, because it means you can't allow one entity to be the totally dominating factor over everything else. That's not how a healthy ecosystem works. And so that's a pretty important paradigm shift when one starts to think about leadership patterns.